Today I'm going to be discussing some common medical school resources for beginners. So there are so many different resources that medical students can use during their studies. So I'm not going to go over everything because there's a lot, but I'm going to go over some of the most common ones and the ones that I know about the most. So I guess the first question would be, why is it that medical students use more than one resource? Isn't lecture enough? Because no one resource is all-encompassing. Some materials lack certain pieces of information, but give you great explanations for certain topics. So for example, resource A provides you with some great explanations, but there's a lot of areas where it doesn't give you as much information, but you'll find resource B that does cover the information that resource A doesn't have, and also has great explanations, but for other things. So it's kind of like that. I mentioned this in another video, but at my school, if you just study the lecture material, you'll be able to do well in your studies for the most part. But if you want to study for step one, you're going to need to use some additional resources. Or if you just want to supplement your lecture material, you could use these additional resources as well. Not all medical schools provide these resources to you. Majority of the time, you have to pay for it on your own. The step one exam is the exam, like big exam that you take after your first 2 years of medical school. That exam is kind of like the MCAT's mom, to put it simply. The score you get on step one exam can be used to decide if you get into certain residencies. So that exam is quite important, also causes quite a bit of stress for a lot of students. One of the resources that some of you have probably heard about is first aid. What is first aid? So first aid, a lot of students consider it the holy grail, etc., etc. But first aid does not have all the information that you need to know. Treat the first aid book as an outline, because that's essentially what it is. It's giving you an outline of the stuff that you need to know, but it doesn't provide you with all of the information you need to know. There are certain keywords in the first aid book that could possibly show up on the STEP exam to help you figure out what the answer is. For example, there's a disease called Burkitt lymphoma, and it has a starry sky appearance. When you see the phrase starry sky appearance in context, you might think, maybe the answer is Burkitt lymphoma, because you read starry sky appearance and you know that that is associated with Burkitt lymphoma. This is just an example. Starry sky appearance is associated with a couple of other things too, but in context, it might help you figure out what the answer is. So first aid has that sort of stuff in it, but don't rely just on first aid for studying for the step one exam. I'll make a separate video on studying for step one. Right now, I'm just going to talk about the resources in general. While you're studying, you're in your first 2 years of medical school, usually a lot of students in their first year didn't really look at first aid because at that point you're just getting used to medical school. You're just trying to study all the information that's given to you initially. So not a lot of people crack open first aid, but I think the earlier you at least look at it and flip through it, it makes you a little bit more comfortable with that book and how things are organized and just how it looks, how the information is presented and organized in that book. Because if you open first aid when you are studying for step one for the first time, you might be really overwhelmed. Like, oh my God, where is everything? Where's the information about cardiology? Where's the information about neurology? How is it organized within each section? There's so much information, oh my goodness, because it's a lot of information. It truly is. So the earlier you familiarize yourself with the organization of the first aid book and how things are written in it, the better off you'll be later on. You might not be as overwhelmed. So definitely take a look at first aid in the beginning, in your first year of medical school. You don't necessarily have to buy it. You could ask maybe someone who's a semester ahead or 2 semester aheads and just ask them, hey, can I just look through your book? And what students also do, especially in their second year of medical school, is that they'll get the first aid book or maybe an online copy of the first aid book and they'll start annotating. Annotating basically means that all the material that I learn in lecture that I think is really important, I'll type that onto my electronic first aid book, or if I have the physical copy of first aid, For example, if I'm learning about the heart in my second year of medical school, I'll flip open to the cardiology section and I'll look at the specific topic that I'm learning in lecture, and I'll write down some of the important lecture material onto the first aid book. This way, when it comes time to study for step 1, you have your pages of first aid filled with important information from your lecture that's not already in first aid. Because remember, first aid is like an outline book. It doesn't have all the information. Your lecture material might give you more information that's important that's not in first aid. So you can put that into first aid. So all your information is there. You don't need to look at your lecture stuff, most likely, when you're studying for step 1. You could just look at your first aid book. And the same goes for if you're using other resources that give you important information. You can also put that information into your first aid book. That way, you don't have to reference like 3 different resources during your step 1 studying, and you can just look at first aid. This can get complicated because there's so much information. Try to organize your notes neatly on first aid, because you don't want to look back at your first aid book and be like, whoa, what did I write? That's a lot of scribbles here and there. I can barely read this. It looks cluttered. No, try your best to be as organized as you can. Or you could just type it out. That way it's like neat. Whatever floats your boat. First aid, also the way that it's organized in general for systems meaning like the different body systems, like your brain, neurology, heart, cardiology, lungs, respiratory, kidney, renal, blood, hematology. They're separated into those kind of systems, along with more general topics like biochemistry or microbiology. But for the systems, each section is separated into 4 different parts: embryology, physiology, pathology, and pharmacology. So, for example, the blood, hematology. The embryology section, what kind of hemoglobin do embryos produce? And then it'll move on to physiology. You'll have a couple of pages of blood physiology. So what is hemoglobin? What is hemoglobin made of? It's made of 4 globins. It has an affinity for oxygen, and I'll show you some graphs and stuff like that. And then the blood pathology section will talk about diseases related to blood, like sickle cell disease and alpha and beta thalassemias, and I'll talk about the mechanism behind those diseases and what the symptoms are. And again, it doesn't go into great detail in first aid because it's basically an outline, but that's what the pathology section is. And then finally, we'll have a couple of pages of pharmacology. Pharmacology are the drugs used to treat these blood disorders. What are the drug names? What class of drugs are they in? How do they work? How does the human body react to them? What are the adverse effects of those drugs? Who should you give those drugs to, and who should you avoid giving those drugs to? These are the 4 sections that each of the systems are typically split up into. Again, flip through first aid from the very beginning just to familiarize yourself with it, and so you're not completely lost when you look at it in your second year, for example.